The bonus action spell rule in 5th edition has caused a lot of confusion and frustration over the last decade, but it's officially gone in D&D 24. Or rather, it has been replaced with a new rule that is simpler to understand on the surface, but causes a lot of gameplay changes and gives a lot of new options. With the flood of content surrounding D&D 24, as bigger creators than I have poured over their advanced copies and produced videos galore on the subjects, I'm going to be diving in a little bit deeper on specific rules and the implications that they have for our gameplay. If that's something that you'd like to see more of, then don't forget to like and subscribe and drop a comment down below that lets me know what rule or change you would like me to dive deeper on. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything summarized the old rule quite nicely by saying that if you want to cast a spell that has a casting time of 1 bonus action, remember that you can't cast any other spells before or after it on the same turn except for cantrips with a casting time of 1 action. I always summarize this rule for newer players as the no 2 leveled spells rule, and though I realize that that's not perfectly accurate thanks to the option to action surge, for every other class it pretty much took care of things. And so it's no surprise that the new spell rule follows similar language to what I used to use with new players. But there's a very important distinction that they make that opens up a load more options. According to folks with advanced copies, the new rule reads like this. On a turn, you can expend only 1 spell slot to cast a spell. This means you can't, for example, cast a spell with a spell slot using the magic action and another using a bonus action on the same turn. The very careful emphasis on the use of a spell slot is the big change that makes all the difference in this. This change in the rules makes a number of things that weren't possible before possible, but also makes a small handful of things that were possible no longer possible. For instance, the one outlier to my old explanation for people who were having trouble understanding this rule of action surging fighters, that's now no longer a possibility. Because if you're expending your action surge in order to take a second action to cast a spell, you're still spending 2 spell slots in a round. Even if they both take actions, that option is no longer on the table. Perhaps more impactfully, as something that happened at the table more frequently, you can now also no longer expend your reaction to cast a spell using a spell slot on your turn. This means that wizards can no longer counterspell a counterspell against the spell that they just cast. I know that gets convoluted, but those counterspelling wars were fun. And you also can't use silvery barbs in order to land the spell that somebody just successfully saved against if you were the one casting it. Unless, of course, it falls into one of the categories that's coming up in the things that you can do that you couldn't do before. Because what's really changed is the fact that now you have to use a spell slot in order to run across this problem, which means that any other source that gives you access to magic but does not require you to utilize your spell slots is fair game. For instance, a lot of people gained access to silvery barbs using the feat Fey Touched. And that feat gives you a free casting of the spell as well as allowing you to expend your spell slots to cast it further times. So while I mentioned that you can't use silvery barbs to stop somebody from saving against a spell that you had just cast on your turn, that's not entirely correct because now it depends on where your source is. If you took the Fey Touched feat and have access to a free casting that will not expend your spell slot, then you can go ahead and do this. This change applies across the board to any kind of access that you might have to spells that do not utilize your spell slots, whether that's because you have spells granted because of your feats, or spells granted because of your species, or spells that are granted as free casts because of your class or subclass. Ones that we've already had revealed that we know are coming in the next edition, including Hunter's Mark for Rangers, Misty Step for Warlocks of the Archfey, Divine Smite for Paladins, and Spiritual Weapons for War Clerics. All of these spells are going to be able to be cast not using a spell slot, which then allows you to use a spell that takes a spell slot on your turn as well. You couldn't, under the old rules, for instance, as a sorcerer, use a bonus action to quicken a fireball and then use a wand of fireballs to double dip and cast a second one because the wand said that you can use an action to expend 1 or more of its charges to cast the fireball spell. However, now you do not have that restriction because it won't use your personal spell slots, meaning that a host of magic items, but most obviously the wands, staves, and spell scrolls, are now available on the table to be able to use to double dip your magic from lots of different sources. This is a huge buff to magic items, but also specifically to the sorcerer class, where they might have seen some kind of rebalancing and weakness granted to the twin spell that was ubiquitously the best meta magic. Quicken is still king, and even more so than ever before. Another interesting interaction is the fact that Mystic Arcanum from Warlocks do not cost spell slots because they are effectively once-a-day abilities, meaning that all of your Mystic Arcanum will also be able to be combined with the casting of a spell slot, assuming of course you have the actions to be able to still produce both. Maybe there's still some space for a multi-classed fighter. And so of course the big question is, what effect is this going to have overall on our game? And there's a couple of obvious points, like the fact that it's going to be a major buff for sorcerers and the quicken meta magic, and the less obvious buff that it also applies to any class that gains some form of free casting of their spells, which, if there are any decent spells in the ranger and paladin lists, might go some way to offsetting the dislike for those classes' rework. There's the minor debuff to action surging wizardry that we mentioned, but because of the opening up of magic items for those classes, it's probably not going to hurt as bad as all that. But the biggest problem that I see with this new rule is that it's not actually going to reduce the complexity or confusion necessarily, because now, even though the rule itself is simple, the fact that it is applicable in some circumstances and not applicable in others, depending on whether or not you're expending a spell slot, is probably going to confuse new players just as much as the old rule did. For those of us who've been at it for a while, that's not a big deal, but for the new player, this doesn't actually make anything tremendously more approachable, realizing that, for instance, the exact example of silvery barbs being okay one time but not okay the next time is just going to cause a little bit of confusion for those players. This rule is also going to have a very unusual effect on dungeon masters, because none of the new stat blocked out creatures are being given spell slots, even if they are a traditional spellcasting character. Their list of spells that they get are usually listed as X per day of specific spell types, which means that this rule is never going to apply on the DM side of the table, allowing a bonus action and a regular action to both be cast from your spell list anytime. That's actually a bit of a kick in the pants for the players, because the DM is not going to be beholden to this rule like everybody else is. All in all, this is of course guesswork, so I'm excited to see how this will impact play when it actually hits the table. What rule in 2024 do you want to have a deeper dive into to see what changes it'll make in your game? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching and happy adventuring.